Okay, welcome everyone. As the room fills up, welcome to Continuous Equity Strategy Improvement when evaluation is in service of equity. We are hosting this as part of a webinar series, and this is the 6th out of our 7-part installment for webinars. Had a really great attendance, and so thank you for any return visitors, and thank you for some new curious minds to the topic of today. I just want to give a few more seconds as the room fills up. Got about 145, 47 so far. People are still trickling in. So as we have people come in, I'm going to go ahead and just cover some of the kind of housekeeping for today. So this webinar will be recorded, and we will be providing that recording out to anyone who's registered. You'll have that tomorrow in your inboxes, so keep an eye out. And of course, everyone, as you enter, are muted, but we do please encourage to use the question panel to submit any questions or comments throughout the whole webinar. We will be taking some audience questions a little bit towards the end of the webinar, so please get those in so we can start to corral and figure out, okay, which ones are we going to get time for. Also, if you do have any technical issues, my colleague Evelyn Heltzel is standing by, so if you need her, please use the email there at the bottom. The other thing I want to mention is that we do have some handouts in the handout section of the panelist bios, so if you want to get to know them a little bit better, as well as the slide deck. So if you want to download that now, it's only available during the webinar, so if I download that now, you'll have that as reference as we go through, and you can follow along. Okay. So today, as mentioned, my name is Daniel Pagan. I'll be co-moderating with Kian Lee, who's leading the conversation today, and we're both from community science. And you know a little bit about us. You've seen my face, as I've met a couple times now if you've been here. Kian's second, brave soul to do a second webinar. But I want to know, or we all want to know a little bit about who's here today. So I'm just going to pull up a quick poll. If you all want to take just the next 30 seconds to kind of fill out, who are you really here representing today? Yourself, or maybe a community nonprofit, maybe you work for a government agency. Wow, you all are very quick. Got about 207 people in here so far, and almost about 80% of you have responded and
wow,
doing well. Yeah, that was quick. Everyone was like right on point for that poll. That's how I know there's a lot of return visitors. You all were expecting it. So let's just see where we're at. Got pretty good participation. And largely 60% researchers, consultants, and evaluators. So everyone's curious on how to really use equity or evaluation in service of equity. We also have a good portion of people from community nonprofits and government agencies or government departments. So welcome everyone. We look forward to hearing some of your audience questions and of course sharing some of our own ideas about evaluation in service of equity. With that, today, just want to run through the agenda really quick. What we're going to be talking about, did our brief welcome. We will introduce the panelists, and Kian will help to frame up the question of really how evaluation contributes to equity. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion from the panelists, answer a few questions around that, and provide their experience. And then, of course, take some audience questions. So with that, I want to kick it off to Kian Lee.
Hi, I think the poll is still on the screen.
Close that up.
Yep. All right, thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
So hello everybody, and thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists for being here today. I want to start by simply recognizing that it's taken hundreds of years to build the inequitable systems that we have today, and we will not dismantle those systems overnight. I so first want to pay tribute to all the people who have come before us to even make this conversation possible today, and a step in the right direction. Some of the information I'll be presenting to you today may not be new. Some of it may be, but I'm hoping that the way we have put all the pieces together will spark a new thought or a new way of looking at things for you. So, even before the pandemic and all the recent unrest, some evaluators have already begun to challenge the role of evaluation for communities of color and other communities that have been historically disadvantaged or oppressed. From responsive evaluation to democratic evaluation and transformative evaluation, and more recently, culturally responsive evaluation and now equitable evaluation, evaluators are calling into question the role of evaluation in creating a more equitable and just world. Evaluators aren't the only ones doing this. Funders, program managers, advocates, and community leaders also have raised questions about the role of evaluation in creating such a world. There are so many different reactions when it comes to the role of evaluation. One, as you'll see on this page, is that evaluation has the potential to advance racial, gender, and other forms of equity, and it should do so. Very exciting for many of us who are on the forefront and in the evaluation profession. And then there's the reaction that, if the evaluation is committed to the initiative's racial justice goal, well, then the evaluator can't possibly be objective, which then makes the evaluation scientifically not rigorous. Then there's the reaction that data, especially quantitative data and evaluation and logic models, are all white men's tools and therefore have no place in our struggle for racial equity. And then last but not least, there's always the, well, isn't it the evaluation's job to operationalize and measure equity? When often really it's the strategists and the program designers, it's just as much as their responsibility to come up with what equity means in that context. It's typical for evaluators to be hired after an equity-focused initiative. So this is really one of the big problems we have in the field. So here's the thing. Evaluation is only as good as the strategy to achieve racial equity, gender equity, or any other type of equity, right? If the strategy is inadequate in how it defines, operationalizes, and shifts power to move the needle on equity, well, the evaluation cannot move that needle. So with that, really in any evaluation of a strategy that aims to advance racial equity, the focus has to be on learning, not accountability or judgment or merit, and figure out the most effective constellation of strategies to shift power and the influence of culture, context, and history on the process of achieving equity and its outcomes. So I hope that what we can discuss today is a different way to think and practice evaluation. The methods are often not different. I mean, we still need focus groups. We still need, experimental designs in so many ways. We still need, surveys. We still need all that, but it's how we put it all together, how we use them, and how we ask the right questions in them. And that's how we're going to make sure that equity is baked into the entire process. So with this, I'm going to pause now and ask our panelists today to introduce yourselves. If you all can say, please, your name, your organization, and share with us what you do in your organization, that would be great. Maybe I'll start with Cynthia, since I'm looking at the screen. I'm going from left to right.
Hi, thank you, Ken. I'm Cynthia Silva Parker. I am a senior associate at Interaction Institute for Social Change, and we build collaborative capacity for folks who are driving social change and racial equity work. So that's training, consulting, coaching, a whole collection of activities.
Thank you. Ilana.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Kian, so much for having me. I'm really excited for today's conversation and to hear from the other panelists. My name is Ilana Needle. I am the director of the Racial Equity Anchor Collaborative, which is a constellation of 9 racial equity organizations that are working together to enhance civic engagement in communities of color to achieve racial equity. And we're funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation.
Thank you. Anita?
Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be with you and connecting with you today. I'm Anita Patel. I direct the leadership programs at the Bush Foundation. And I always like to make sure people know that's not connected to the political Bush family. This is related to someone who started 3M. So we support great ideas and the people who power them. And my work is around leadership programs and around kind of field building in the leadership development field so that racial equity is at the center.
Thanks, Anita. Wilan, I think you're on mute.
Oh, I muted. I followed the direction from Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Kian. I am Huilan Kran. I am with the Kellogg Foundation. As the Director of Learning and Impact, I oversee the Foundation's evaluation approach and strategy. I'm also responsible for rolling up the evaluation findings from our priority places in Mississippi, New Orleans, Michigan, New Mexico, Mexico, Haiti, and the US nationwide to provide our board and the leadership a sense of our impact. And as you probably know, racial equity is one of our 3 components of our DNA. The other 2 are community engagement and leadership development.
Thank you, Wilan. So wonderful to have you all here. And really, I think you all bring such diverse perspectives, and you sit in different places in your organization and have a different perspective on all of this, a different angle, which I think hopefully will lead to a very rich discussion today. So before we dive into some of the content that I will be presenting, here's a question for you all. You're each involved in strategy, design, and in evaluation, right, in some form or shape. So what do you think are 1 or 2 things that the evaluator must attend to and master in order to serve movements for racial, gender, or any other type of equity? So whoever wants to go first.
Since I have myself unmuted, I'm going to start. That's a very big question, especially when you look at the question itself. It says serving movements for equity. In our case, we are actually focusing on racial equity. Doing that requires evaluating and examining systems. But we all know that systems are complex and complicated, partially because of they're value-laden, and partially because of what Kian has said earlier, that the data is more qualitative than quantitative, and also the data may be incomplete, vague, and tangled together. For that reason, one of the practices that I have found helpful is to ask the questions. Then what questions to ask actually matter, because your questions would allow your stakeholders to peek in, look, see, and dissect the systems to expose the systemic inequities or disparities. Dissecting a system can be from examining the people in the system, power, programs, practices, and policies. This requires, at the foundation at least, it requires that evaluators work very closely with the program teams, present relevant data timely for the program staff and the leadership to reflect on and use for strategy adjustments and or confirmation of doubling down on certain effective strategic choices.
Thanks, Wilan. Talk more about that.
Yeah, I think I was going to build a little bit on what you're saying, Milan, because it is so hard to think about cause and effect when you're trying to intervene in a system. So having a really broad-based systems view, I think, is critical. And having a sort of a multifaceted way of thinking about success. In our organization, we talk about 3 different dimensions of success. One of them is the results, like, are the children reading it at grade level by third grade? Or Are women and men being employed at the same rate or being paid the same if it's a gender equity initiative you're after? So there are actual outcomes, some of which you can track quantitatively and some qualitatively. And you also have to pay attention to process. How is power being managed? How are stakeholders being involved? Who's making decisions? Are we making good use of the time and talents and other kinds of resources that we have? And also things like, let's imagine on racial equity that you're doing an internal organizational change process. One indicator on the process side might have to do with how you develop staff to help them be ready for a promotion from within, as opposed to, say, hiring people from outside for all your top positions. So you've got to track the processes that you need in order to get those outcomes. And sometimes it can be very helpful to have somebody name those processes and acknowledge what's working about them on the way to getting the outcomes. And then the third sort of dimension of success is relationship, both the relationship that people have to the effort that there's our favorite triangle. This idea that there are relationships between each person and the work you're trying to do. Are people inspired? Are they feeling trusted? Do they feel supported? And are they actually being well supported to do the work they're being asked to do? Are the relationships between individuals and between institutions, even if you're thinking about networks, because hardly any of the systems change work happens within just a single organization. So what are metrics and ways to think about measuring the quality and strength and density of relationships in a network? And the other thing I would just pick up on it that you said is that this is as much a tool for planning and strategy development on the one hand as it is, maybe Kian, you also said this, if you build your strategy with these three things in mind and you say, here's what we're going for, then you've got something for an evaluator to work with, or you yourselves have something to work with if you can't hire an external evaluator. But at the end, it's pretty hard to retrofit an evaluation to a strategy that didn't have any of those things in mind.
Thank you.
Well, and I think talking about kind of the beginning and the end and what's there, when I think, Kian, about things that evaluators must attend to, I think about the great work, to be transparent, community science really did as we worked with them in thinking about what is the history of evaluation? Where has it been helpful and where has it been hurtful in movements around racial equity and intersectional equity? And I think being transparent about that up front and co-creating the evaluation with the folks that we are sharing their stories, we're sharing the work that's happening, so that the evaluation can be in service to the movement and not something that is damaging to the people who are in that movement. And that's just, I think it takes time. It takes time to build that trust, and it takes resources to build that trust, but it's so critical in order to help and not cause harm.
Yep.
Thanks, Kian. This is a great question, and maybe it should be asked at the start of every evaluation so you can contextualize it within that evaluation. And again, I'm going to echo a bit of what Anita said. We found the process of thinking as an evaluator, as a partner, as a co-author, and how you're going to tell this story of whatever you're evaluating to be really foundational and effective in ensuring that that equity is baked in from the beginning and that the strategies align between the evaluation and the programmatic strategy of whatever you're evaluating. And this, I think, really can also position the evaluation as a tool. So the evaluation work can work for the work itself, if you will. And I wish we would stop thinking of it as a separate entity and understand that the evaluation itself can be a lever of change, and it can benefit not just the grant recipients and the beneficiaries at the end of the stream, but the funders in the field. And then I think the final thing is, it was interesting, Kian, as you were going through the different names that we've given evaluation for equity, there are iterations, right, of something that came before. So what we're also doing is we're always growing together and understanding how evaluation can work together to amplify the benefits of the field, but also maybe where it's harming and where we can do better.
Great, thank you all. You know, trying to think about what you all said and all those keywords that came up, that you use different words, but you were all really pointing to the same thing. The concept of systems and power really, I think, is really important when you think about anything around equity, right? And trying to work towards equity. So an evaluator being able to think like that is really important. The other part is the relationship, right? Sort of the relationship between the program team and the evaluator, having to work closely. I think Ilana used the word being co-author, being partners. You don't want to, you want to do it from the beginning, not the end, because you can't go back and retrofit the evaluation. So that relationship is really key. You know, I think someone talked about transparency, and I often think we fight in this world about what is considered scientific rigor. And when we're talking about sort of the quantitative, you know, research and evaluation, everybody has a definition of rigor, right? And then when we get to the qualitative, everybody kind of folds and goes, well, what do we mean? But I think those terms that you use, transparency, is so important. That's really part of rigor, right? Being transparent about what you're going to do and how evaluation can be used to harm and not for good, and how do we prevent that. Having the integrity, right? To be at the table and to be honest, to be candid. I think one of the things I've learned is that I can be, or any evaluator who's committed to this can be committed to racial justice, can be committed to the social agenda of the program or the strategy, but nevertheless, you know, you can still be honest and give feedback about how it can be better, right? So it doesn't make you less rigorous. In fact, it should make you more rigorous. So I think that's really important. So these were the kind of things, I think, how do you define success, right? And that it's not just one thing, but you have to look at multiple things in the process and the outcome. And really, how do you ask the right questions? I think I want to land on that point. That's really important, because these things we know, but it's really in the questions we ask and that we push. So with that, I'm going to move to this next slide, because everything you said pointed to this. This is what we think of as a continuous strategy improvement towards racial equity. And I think Ilana or somebody mentioned this about how you're learning, right? And all the terms that came before this, and we've been constantly learning how to get better, and challenging the science of all of what we believe is supposed to happen, and challenging the mental models that we have. So the idea is that, you know, a typical strategy process would include 3 big stages. In the design and in the planning stage, what are we really trying to do? If you have a focus on equity, like racial equity, you're really trying to get to the roots of that, and you're trying to get to the levers of change for that. That's a design and plan stage. Like, what are those things, so you can fully understand the problem and solve it at a systemic level. The second thing is, you know, implementation. That's what happens. You got your design, you got your plan, you're ready to implement, which means you're working towards it. You're working towards racial equity or any other form of equity. That's in the doing. And then at some point you want to go, well, what do we learn? So what, right? And I always ask this question, so what? Because we can describe things like, you know, this program encountered these challenges and 20% of the people changed their minds. And you go, and so what? What does that mean? And we seldom get to that level, because that's where the hard conversations happen. And so throughout this process, what's happening is that you're listening, you're understanding, you're assessing what you know, and you're reconstructing new ways of thinking. So it's really a critical way of thinking about this stuff. It's kind of the definition of critical thinking. And then your other feedback loop is you're constantly reflecting, learning, and acting to become more effective. What's undergirding this entire process is evaluative thinking. And the evaluative thinking about identifying and making explicit assumptions about what you think works and doesn't work, why, asking thoughtful questions along the way, and understanding more deeply, communicating things, and having some real courageous and difficult conversations. And so going to what Wilan said, it's really in the questions you ask. And so here are some questions that we put together that we seldom ask, or we at least don't ask enough. The most important one, what is unfair, unjust, and for whom? You know, in any project, in any evaluation, we go, well, the African-American population is this, and the Asian population is this. They're not homogenous, they're not monolithic, so that For whom is a really important question to keep hitting home on, right? What are the systems and levers of change that impact the root causes, and who has the power to push and pull those levers of change? That's an important question to ask. We're right off the bat, we're questioning where power lies. The next set of questions, sort of around, working towards racial equity, we're asking the same thing. We're asking about, but now we're saying, like, what's different and what tailored supports are needed? Going back to John Powell's targeted universalism concept, right? Yeah, we want outcomes that lift everybody up, but how we get there is going to have to be tailored to context, history, circumstances. So we want to ask those questions. One of the important things that come out is, what are the cultural and social norms that dominate in implementation? We don't even think about it in implementation. What's the dominant cultural and social norms driving implementation? Again, also looking at interconnections in systems that affect implementation. And in the last box, so what? And the so what here is what's changed in systems, conditions, outcomes, and again, for whom, right? That for whom, if we leave out, we'll gloss over it, pat ourselves on our backs and move on. But that for whom, we have to again ask, how has power shifted? I've learned this from, my racial justice colleagues. What are the unintended benefits and consequences? Sometimes we don't even think about that. We're so focused on what we want to achieve and what we don't want, we forget that that might be some unintended outcomes there. I think what Ilana said about co-authorship earlier on, whose story is it to tell? Whose story does this belong to, right? And if the evaluator is part of the co-author of the story, then it's our story as much as everybody else's story, and we have to make sure it's told right and told well, and told in a way that doesn't harm communities even more. So I think these are this is like, to me, a different way of thinking. What happens as an evaluator who does this work is that you get into it, and this is where things start to happen. So there's a lot of resources that are not evaluation related that the evaluators need to develop, the kinds of trainings they need to start to attend, because these little micro processes is what happens in each of these boxes. Daniel, can you switch to the next slide, please? This is what happens when you start getting into the work, right? We begin to realize that the communities affected by disparities were not engaged in an equitable manner. In fact, they were asked in a very tokenistic way to give some input. We realize that there are lots of power differences in organizations and in communities that play out once we get our hands dirty and we're in it on a day-to-day basis, that can delay or hinder implementation. Leaders' expectations of change are unrealistic. Many funders want attribution. It may not be possible. You're looking at contribution. So how can you be satisfied with that? We've come across this a lot in our work. Offensive remarks are made during data collection activities. And funny, when you do telephone interviews and your interviewee doesn't know who's on the other side of the phone and doesn't know what you look like, and they say certain things derogatory about a particular group, sometimes it could be your group, how do you stop that process? Right? We wrestle with this in our own organization. How do you stop that process and then not bias that interview, right? So how do you actually deal with that? Because it's a learning moment, right? Even in workshops, we've discovered this. It's a learning moment. So how do you grab that learning moment without like causing the results to be different or biasing it? Staff don't have the capacity to implement the strategy. Sometimes it could be staff of color, and you question as to, like, do they have access to professional development or other kinds of skills and knowledge to be able to get better? Sometimes it can be, white staff who may not have the capacity or skills to understand equity and to be able to work through that. And then there are outcomes not achieved because, there are just things that happen in the environment and the circumstances that don't allow you to get there. So as an evaluator, I mean, when you get to this point and all of this starts to blow up in your face, how do you respond to this? You can't walk away and say, I'm just the evaluator, step out. That does not make you an evaluator or conduct an evaluation in service of equity. So I think this is kind of one of the points I feel very strongly about, is how do we in the evaluation profession begin to understand that it's more than our technical skills, we're more than technicians. And how do we take that responsibility to be able to lean in on this kind of equity work and be part of that equity work. And I remember Melvin Hall, a great evaluation colleague, who said, like, once you do this, yes, recognize that you as the evaluator, you become part of the intervention. And that's okay. And that does not make you any less objective or any less rigorous. So with that, I'm actually going to pause and ask my colleagues on this webinar, can you share one thing that you have seen worked well in embedding equity into a strategy and/or an evaluation? And of course, any comments you want to make in response to what I just presented.
I can start if that's okay with folks, since I ended last time. This is another great question and difficult to do. We are a collaborative of 9 organizations that are multiracial, and we represent 4 specific racial and ethnic groups, 2 of which are often what we call the asterisk groups. So there'll be an asterisk just thrown up and say the sample sizes are too small, so we can't do this analysis on them. So you're erasing them completely from whatever you're doing. And this happens most often in America with the American Indian and Alaska Native population and the Asian American, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population. So a strategy that we've been using and has been, I believe, working well throughout the evaluation is ensuring that all of those voices are included from the beginning. So even before you start asking what questions are we going to ask, you need to get the right people at the table and make sure that they're integrated and embedded and it's not in a token way, and that they do get to ask and push back on all those power dynamics that Kian mentioned earlier.
Thank you.
I think I might build on what you're saying, Alana, about the right people at the table, because one of the things I think we think of as important in driving for equity is, first of all, to ask the question, what do we actually mean by that? So there are procedural aspects to equity, and there are outcomes, right back to results and process. So we've been working with a national sort of education reform network that has local chapters around the country. And from the very beginning of designing their equity planning process, they made a decision that the planning team would have to have a 50-50-ish mix, or maybe even a little more representation from their network than from the national office, because they recognized from the beginning, if the national office does all the planning and just grabs a little input here and there from people in the network, it is going to be experienced, and rightly so, as a top-down, we're dropping this on you kind of thing. So they built a more equitable process where people from the network and people from the national office together have been looking into what the challenges are, designing a strategy. They're now in the implementation stage, and they still have a team that has national and network that is guiding the implementation process forward. So it's an example of equitable process on the way to equitable outcomes.
Okay.
I'm going to build on that. So Kian had mentioned for whom, unfair and inequitable for whom, and Elena and Cynthia both talk about who are invited, who are engaged, who actually gets to be part of what. And I would like to actually share one thing. One of the things that we have, our evaluators have worked really well, is to push the thinking of the program staff. And one of those pushes is to ask the question, who sets the table? That is really important. It actually is not like a table is set by somebody and then we invite the people of color to the table. It's actually who set the table talks about, really exposes the disparities in the systems as to the power. Where is the power base? who has the power and beyond. So I think that one of the questions that we all constantly ask is who. So who as the subject, in addition to for whom, with whom, about whom.
I will build on the question of who. I think this is all so right on. So I'll just add one other component, which is thinking about who gets to make meaning from the data, and really letting the participants, the people who provided the data, then look at some of that analysis, say, does this seem right? What would you say? How would you make sense of this? So that before it goes anywhere, we actually make meaning with the people who provided that information. And then the last thing I'll share around this is thinking about how can that evaluation speak truth to power and inspire action for folks who weren't even part of it, right? How can that, thinking about the framing of the evaluation, thinking about what we share externally, how can that continue to inspire change in a movement for racial equity, even if someone wasn't a part of that particular work?
Thank you. So just to sum up, I mean, what I heard was one is really, it's interesting you talk about everything that you said actually has something to do with power, right? That's a consistent theme across all four of your comments. Whether or not, if you're a group that's often left out because of your sheer size or your race or ethnicity, and then whether or not it's because you're a sort of a national local group, right? Again, that's another area where power is that we don't talk about just often, whether it's national or local. How do you have the voices that are often not heard and being at the table to be able to inform decisions? So it's not just about being at the table for the sake of it, but actually being able to push back on decisions and processes so that they can have a voice. I think the other one is that, how do you actually then engage people in interpreting the information so that not only is it accurate and contextualized, it can be used for advocacy, inspiration beyond just like, yeah, the program worked, right? So it has a much more social, it has a function in social movements in that way. That's great. Thank you. I want to see if Daniel, is there a question you want to read from the chat box?
Yeah, so I got two kind of themes are kind of coming up in some of these questions. So one, if you and the panelists could talk a little bit more about defining what we mean by levers of change and the systems that we're talking about, and what are those systems and structures, and how do they affect your roles as evaluators or while you're doing evaluation. That's number one. The second one is really about how do you go about truly engaging the community to get involved in evaluations so that you do know that their voice is being heard and that you're not just listening to the loudest person who represents that community, or maybe who's just being the gatekeeper of the community. Make sure you're getting the real voice. I guess that one.
Yeah, those are two great questions. So I'm going to start with the first, systems. That is really key in this work, and it's probably one of the hardest things to do. We often talk in our organization about how do you see the systems, right? Do you actually see them interconnecting? So I think for us, the systems dynamics, I think it's realizing that there's so many different ways of slicing systems. There's the education system, health system, transportation system. So that all these systems that actually touch people, if you think of a single person, all these systems touch a person's life, and how do they intersect to do that? Often it's one of those things I feel like in our field, we always talk about intersectionality. And to me, intersectionality it's not just identity. We always use it as if it's the person's identity and the person has these intersecting identities, when in fact the person is the whole. It's the systems that are intersecting to affect that person's racial background and how it plays out in whether the person access services or not, or how it plays out in the person's, socioeconomic status and where they live so that they can get to a job. It's those systems that intersect. So to me, there's that system. And then there's the system of there's the community system. Even in communities, you have systems. You have the formal community support system, informal community networks. Those are systems. And then there's always the systems that are around social identities, right? I mean, if you think about any system that deals with racial identity, that could be one system. The systems that deal with gender issues and gender identity is another system, sexual orientation. So to me, there are just a lot of layers of systems that I think about. And when we approach an evaluation, the one thing I will say is that no single person can hold all that. It takes a lot of headspace. And one of the beautiful things about us, and I always encourage people to think about, is how do you work in a team, and how do you make sure your team is pretty diverse in every way? Because what happens is that if you have blinders on, someone can tell you that you have a blinder on. We had an instant where someone said to us, we're feeling this divisiveness in this strategy team, in the program team, and we think it's because of their racial ethnic background. And I said, but 3 people are from the same racial ethnic background, but different ages and different generations. And different gender. So could that be playing into some of those dynamics and the power differences? So and so they're like, oh, we didn't think about it that way. And so you kind of have a team that looks at it from different angle and through different lens of systems to be able to see the whole. So that's one way that I think we've addressed systems and looked at systems. And I'll open it up to our panelists.
I'll follow Kian's line of thinking about systems being intertwined, interconnected, and it's really made up of sub parts in a system or in system of systems. And as an evaluator, I tend to think more linearly, although systems dissecting is never linear. Earlier, I talked about looking at the system in 5 domains or dimensions. So if you can imagine the system as an evaluator, you're looking at the people in the system, the power in the system, the programs in the system, the practices in the system, and the policies in the system. So those are the 5 domains. Then what are you doing with those domains? Then you think about the other dimension, and that is the content of each one of those domains and the context of the domain and the connections among or between the domains. So when you put them together for evaluators, that would give you a starting point of developing either system theory of change or logic model or whatever work plan that you're actually taking on.
Great, thanks, Wilan. I think that's really helpful to think about it. Programs, power, practices, people, and policies in systems.
Right. There are 2 systems, sort of analytical tools for systems that we like to use. One is to think about racism or sexism or anyism as a system that operates on 4 levels, right? So you have in the micro level, there's the internalized, both conscious and unconscious bias, beliefs, values, and there's interpersonal. So how do people interact with one another? And then at the macro level, you've got in any given institution, you've got policies, practices, procedures, and norms, both written and unwritten rules of the road, those kinds of things that you can look at and intervene on. And then you've got at the structural level, the collision or the intersections, as you were both just talking about, how housing affects, your opportunities for education, affects your transportation, affects your access to quality jobs and so forth. So that's at the more structural level. And also the kind of narrative structure that is the glue that holds it all together. What are the stereotypes? What are the tropes in culture, in organizational life, in, pop culture and popular discourse? So sometimes we like to help people on the strategy development side to think about, like, which of those levels are you trying to actually intervene on? Make sure your strategies match it, because a lot of times in organizations, even ones that are trying to achieve equity outcomes, they often have strategies that are at the internalized or at the interpersonal level, and they're expecting institutional level change, or they're expecting, it's one of my favorite pet peeves about the evaluations of comprehensive community change initiatives, right? All of those field level documents say, oh, see, those things don't create comprehensive population level change. Well, guess what? They weren't designed that way. They were designed to have program level impact on the people who participated. And we're asking those things that were built in one way to carry water that they were never designed to build. So again, the relationship between the evaluation and the strategy, we have to be clear about where in the system we're trying to intervene, whether it's, in hearts and minds, practices, behaviors, structures, intersections across structures, narrative work. And what do we think really is going to make change possible, so that we design our programming or our advocacy strategies or our research agenda, whatever it is, with that in mind. And then it's not exactly linear, but there's a good connection between what we plan to do, what we hope will happen, and what we hope our evaluation will show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ilana, I just want to point out the fact that both Wilan and Cynthia, as you were talking, you used different words, but you all were implying very similar context, right? Structures, policies, right? People, relationships. So I just wanted to point that out. Sorry, go ahead, Ilana.
No sweat. These are all amazing points. And I just wanted to pick up on something that Cynthia said and really hammer it home, that often we think of systems as separate, as Hulan said, they're interconnected. But we talk about them and we write about them and we still tell stories about them using messaging and narrative. And that same frame that you use for that messaging and narrative can get put into policies, which are embedded with systems and also reflect what's in the hearts and minds and implicit biases of the initial stage that Cynthia was talking about, the micro level. So there is that interconnection. And when you're talking about strategy, you really do need to think about messaging and narrative and how that impacts equity, especially racial equity.
And I just want to add one piece of evaluators really have such a key role in all of this conversation. I think sometimes there's debate in the field of how much should evaluators lead into these kinds of questions with the folks they're working with, or stay back and really play a more neutral role. And I just, for what it's worth, in our experience, when evaluators can step in with these questions, when they can say, hey, I've seen this in another space, let's bring it here, or I've seen this mistake happen, you're not thinking about, the interconnectedness of the systems, then it just does more harm than good. And again, that's where I keep going back to, where are we really moving the movement forward, and where is it that we are causing harm? And it doesn't rest solely with any one person in that partnership, and it definitely has a huge role for evaluators to bring in that expertise. So I just want to invite that in.
Great, thank you. I think all of that is great, because it really does, it really conveys the complexities, right, of systems. And if we want to move towards equity, how we got to understand that we got to embrace the complexity, first of all. I mean, that's the other part, is that we often don't do. We try and think, we think we can dismantle them tomorrow, and then we think that we can just deal with them with a program. And then we wonder why we didn't get the outcomes we achieved and the needle didn't move, right? Because part of it is the complexity. And I just want to put a plug in here that oftentimes, I shouldn't say sometimes, funding structures, siloed thinking, and all of that don't lend themselves to us embracing and practicing the complexity. I think the second part to that question that Daniel had asked was, besides talking about systems, was the levers of change in a system, right? So maybe we can spend a few minutes talking about that. So we're trying to create change and equity. What are some of the levers of change that we need to consider? How do we look for them?
I might jump in here. There are a couple of things that I rely on. One of them is something that wasn't tailor made for equity, but turns out to be very helpful, which is the wheel of change that comes out of the Social Transformation Project. Very simple, think of them as 3 gears that kind of interlock. One is hearts and minds, right? How are we engaging the people, the humans in the system, and the humans who are outside trying to influence the system? So that's one of the gears. Another is practices, behaviors, norms, some of the written and unwritten things that people do inside systems and again from outside, in trying to influence from outside. And then the third is the formal structures, right? So how is it that resources are allocated, decisions are made, people are involved in various kinds of processes, staff and community members or whoever your constituents are. So one way to think about levers of change is to ask yourself, what is it in each of those arenas? What do we need to shift in hearts and minds? What do we need to shift in system and structure, and also in the day-to-day practice and norms and behaviors? Because we know that if you say change a law, that's a structural thing, and you don't change hearts and minds, you may not get fidelity in practice, right? Whether it's a law or it's a regulation. I mean, we have 100 years of history of that, writ large. So that's one way of thinking about it. And then I'm actually really partial to the study Awake to Woke to Work that Equity in the Center put out maybe a year or so ago, where they identified 2 big categories of change levers. One was about engaging different stakeholder groups. So what are you doing to engage senior leaders? What are you doing to engage governing structure, people who are in your governing structure? What are you doing to engage your staff? How are you engaging your constituents? I think maybe those are the 4. And then, well, how are you creating conditions in your organization for learning and continuous improvement? And I'm forgetting there's one other kind of condition setting thing that I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But this idea that there's leverage in how you engage people, and there's leverage in how you create conditions for people to behave and work together differently.
Great, thanks. I always have this picture when you were talking, Cynthia, I have this image of systems being sort of like the idea of, maybe a box or something like that. And then the levers being all over that box, right? And then you have to think about which one do you push or pull to open which part of the box? That's how I think about it. That image sticks to me. It's never one, it's always multiple.
So that's a great question. Levers of change is actually probably the most challenging questions that evaluators would have to face in working with programs teams or program staff. I'm actually thinking about, typically evaluators, we develop theory of change or logic model by starting with assumptions, inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. For this kind of very complex and complicated efforts, I suggest that we do it backwards. You look at the results and look at what disparities or inequities in the results that you want to change. Then you work backwards to find, it's like peeling the onion, but making the direction differently, like from this side, from the right, moving back to the left, so that you are able to actually identify the appropriate or the relevant levers of in the system that you want to change and that you can take advantage of, or you can hold on to actually do something.
Thanks, Wilan. When you were saying it made me think about this image that we have right now on the screen about how do we flip this backwards? So what questions can we ask now, starting from the so what, right? This is now asking in a way that's past tense, right? What changed? But now flipping it and thinking more future tense, but starting from right to left. Thank you.
Another component I think we have to keep asking in this is, how are we considering emotions as data? This is racial equity work. This is about our lives. This is, I mean, we are doing this work because we do not have equity. And that means that emotion is part of this conversation. And I think when we choose to dismiss emotion or try to interpret it ourselves without understanding what's really being conveyed, we lose valuable conversation in what that movement is about and how to really evaluate experience, progress. So I just want to bring that in. I don't think we've talked a lot about emotion in this, and it's a key role as we evaluate this work.
That's awesome, Anita. Thank you. I'm going to come back to that point. Ilana, do you want to add?
Sure. I think there's one area that it's easy to get mired into, and it's easy to think about the levers of the change and the outcomes and not think about the incremental changes along the way and the things that we don't do well and what lessons we're learning a lot from that. So I would, and I would also emphasize that, as we said earlier, those big systemic changes are inherently difficult to create. So for example, people talk about the Occupy Wall Street movement, and they say, well, they didn't collapse the capitalist system, so it didn't achieve any of its goals. But in actual fact, what it did for movements and how movements are structured and the power endemic of movements is really big, and people don't talk about, or it's not elevated in the narrative as much, and it's just as important.
Yeah. So what all four of you actually said, I just want to repeat. I mean, you touch on the whole idea of levers of change from a different angle. One is that starting backwards, what you said, Ilana, just being like, it's incremental change, right? So we're not jumping from A to, you know, Z, but really A to even A, maybe even A plus, like the small steps in between that signals progress and movement in some ways. And I always say in this work, you can take 5 steps forward and then move 10 steps backward, right? Does that mean you're actually not making progress? I don't know. Sometimes conflict is progress, right? You know, if we get conflict, that's not a bad thing. So I think that's important to recognize, which then goes to the emotions of it too. This is hard work, and we all get emotional no matter what. You know, I know that even as evaluators, it's supposed to be objective, you're going to get emotional about this. And one of the stories I remember was someone saying, you know, at a workshop that I was at about the role of evaluation in promoting change, about how, you know, I don't want to take this job because when I start to assess the readiness of the organization and they just don't think about racial equity, they're just not there yet, I can't deal with it, and I walk away. And one of a great evaluator asked that person, well, if you walk away and you understand it, who's going to come after you to do this that may not understand it? And you've just lost an opportunity to actually educate and make a small contribution. And it really made me think about it. It's like, yeah, it's hard, and you got to wrestle with this, and you got to deal with your own emotions. The third part is, you know, what I think Wilan said, just in terms of moving backwards, thinking about what is it, right? What's the change you want to see? What's the systems? And then peeling away the layers of onion and thinking about the root cause, the lever that you can actually push or pull, and think that way. And the fourth is, I think, what Cynthia said. If you think about hearts and minds and practices and structures and all, each one of them have different levers of change that you can pull and push, and that you don't want to just do one, but you really want to think about how you do multiple ones that are interconnected, because that way you can actually make progress. And the one point I also want to bring up about all of this that you all said, I think is an important point, is the importance of alignment. The alignment in what you want to do, what you're going to do, and what's going to change. I think going back to what Cynthia said about, you know, something that was not even designed to carry the water all the way through. I remember an instant where people, and I think this is really the role of the evaluators while challenging this, where we had a group of program people, community leaders, who talked about wanting to change the policy and system so that it's a better place for vulnerable children and families. And when you looked at what they were trying to do, they were running programs, right? And they were running mentoring programs. Nothing wrong with mentoring programs, but I did ask them, how many children do you serve in those programs? and they said about 100 a year. How many children do you have in your community? Several thousand. How many times do you have to run that program in a year in order to reach that several thousand? So what is it that you can change instead of programs that will get you to that scale that you really want, that ultimate change? And so that light bulb went on. I'm like, oh, we got to think about what policy we can actually weigh in on. So I think that's part of our role in helping groups think that way. So thank you. And we have a few more minutes. And this is great because we left a lot of time for questions and more interaction. There was a second question that I think someone asked that Daniel brought up. What does community engagement look like? And how can it be really, quote unquote, authentic, right, as part of this process? And we hear often from people, and also, you know, funders don't fund enough to do this authentically. So what is authentic? The pushback is that it takes a lot of time. Where's that line between authentic and tokenistic? I think that's an important question.
It is community engagement is very important. And I think that we as professional evaluators need to keep in mind that evaluation needs to be democratized. We need to listen to the community, and we also need to be willing to put the community back in the center of evaluation. And that includes the who again. Who does evaluation? And I think Anita mentioned the point of interpreting data and making meaning out of data. All that, the entire process of doing evaluation needs to have community in the center. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Who set the evaluation table? It's also important. So our job as evaluators is not only to challenge the status quo and the pushback and using data, of course, but also making sure that we do what we preach or what we evaluate. When we take on evaluation activities or a project, we need to make sure that we ask the question, who is coming here as the primary evaluation team? And then, of course, you go through the whole process of designing evaluation, conducting the activities, and sharing the data, analyzing the data, sharing the data, and making meaning out of the data.
Thank you. Community centered. Yep. Anyone else?
I think there is.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Anita. Go ahead, Anita.
Go ahead, Anita. Jump in.
Well, I think that was an awesome summary. And so the piece that it made me think about was really starting with who wants to know this? Why do they need to know it? What do they need to know? You know, speaking as a funder, where we have to, of course, share with our board what kind of impact the work is having. There are lots of different ways to do that, and there are lots of different ways to think about who is the audience for that work and who's shaping it. And there's a temptation, I think, sometimes when you get into evaluation of, oh, we also want to know this, we also want to know this, we also want to know this, and really being clear about, okay, at what point are you revisiting the values of who is the we in that equation? Because if it's not the community asking for it, then really being careful about how much you're asking from community, I think is really important. So I just wanted to add that kind of layer to it.
Mm.
You make such a good point about the who needs to know and who's asking, because often the who's asking and the who needs to know are two different sets of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's asking is your funder or your contracting state agency or what have you. And the who needs to know are the people being served, right? You know, back to something that was on your earlier slide, Ken, about evaluation tools being, you know, the province of the man and therefore irrelevant. people of color are as anxious or more anxious to know that what is being done works. More so than, you know, some of us who are in program design jobs or in evaluation design jobs. And so the question again about who gets to decide what it works, you know, that it works looks like is really important. And it's, you know, a big message to funders when you have the opportunity to, when an organization has the opportunity to have resources for evaluation, to be, I think, you know, it's important to be very transparent about, well, here are 3 things our board really needs to know. And whatever else you all need to know, that's great. And we need these 3 things, right? Rather than to be disingenuous and say, well, we don't, whatever you want is great. But then kind of behind the scenes be pushing for extra questions to be added or extra analysis or what have you. So to come to, you know, it's one of the interesting ways of balancing the power dynamics. I think sometimes, I'm not a funder, but my observation is sometimes the assumption is you balance the power dynamic by hanging back and not stating what's in it for you, but actually that holds more power. So if people can come to the table as peers saying, here's what I'm interested in, here's my interest, my stake in this, and here's my stake in this, let's figure out how we get enough of all of this done so that it's meaningful for everybody. And, you know, I'm thinking back to so many college-related or school-related projects where students come in and they want to know something because they have to write a paper in 6 months. And the people they interviewed and the people they talked to informally and the observations they made are not designed to have any positive lasting impact on anybody. And people are tired, you know, we had generations of that now. So.
Great. Ilana?
I was going to say something very similar to what Cynthia said. And also, I think going back to the original point I made about being co-authors of this journey or story together, make sure that you're sort of leveling out the power differential and making sure that whatever tool or report or whatever you turn out is beneficial for that community as well. And so they're not just getting interviewed and then that's the last time they hear from you. That's happened, as Cynthia said, for many, many years. And you're getting interviewed and you're having an intervention in your community or in your family, and then they ask you questions and then that's it. So that's a disservice. And again, how can we use this evaluation for tools for the end user as well?
Great. Totally agree. And you all made me think about something before we go to try and wrap this up, which is a question I want to ask each of you when we wrap up. I think what you all said brought up for me 3 things that we often don't talk about. One is that, you know, we treat people of color and communities of color sometimes in a very patronizing way, as if like, you know, they don't know, you know, if this is good for them, we have to tell them, or, you know, they don't understand science or they don't understand data and we have to teach them or, you know, protect them. You know, that whole concept of gatekeeper versus gate openers in communities. I mean, evaluators play that role, you know, program people play that role. I think that, like Cynthia said, you know, it's like, that's holding back power, right? If you really think about, you want to equalize that power, let's have that conversation. So I think that's the one thing that gets in the way, and we don't talk about that. The other thing that gets in the way, I think, is this whole client relationships, right? Evaluators are often hired as contractors. Technical assistance people are hired as contractors. And who's your client? It's the funder, right? So, you know, who are you accountable? You really should be accountable to the community. So then how do you push back on the funder? How do you have those conversations? And it's hard. It's hard because, you know, you want to make sure that you have a job. What's the risk in it for evaluators to push back? There is a risk. For some of us who are independent evaluators, maybe not. But for those that are part of a bigger companies, yeah, you might risk losing your job. And if you lose that contract. So that conversation is a hard one that we don't have. And I think until we tackle that one and the economics behind it, I'm not sure how much we can really change and revolutionize this field. So that was my 2 points I wanted to state because you really made me think about it. And before we end, I want to ask each of you to give us some words of wisdom from where you sit as funders, as technical assistants, trainers, coaches, as strategists, program, direction, things like that, from where you sit, what do you think has to change, whether it's in your world, right, or whether it's in another world that you interact with? What needs to change for us to be able to have this kind of process and conversations that you all just so amazingly brought to the table today?
I'll start. Structural racism is centuries in the making. Dismantling it takes courage in so many ways. So evaluators, if you're traditional evaluators like me, we tend to fade in the background and say that this is our role. So I encourage the evaluators to step up and lean in, join the movement.
Thank you, Wilan. Step up and lean in. Evaluators, hear that?
It's a big question, Kian, so I'm struggling to find an answer that I can say succinctly. But I would say that I think evaluation in total should give a bit more credence and belief in what communities know and don't know, but more in what they know, because they do know a lot. And also, I think it's a good point now to really think through that data question, qualitative versus quantitative, emotions as data, evaluation as a lever of change. Like all of our approaches are still from the old times, the before times. And we are in a moment now where it is the moment to pivot and change and push.
Thank you, Ilana. So step up, lean in. It's the moment. It's our moment. We got to do it. Thank you.
I think one thing I would add is to, I think, Wilan, you might have been the one to say it, is to stop looking for causation and start looking for contribution. Because the thing, structural racism isn't, if it could have been solved by one organization doing something really well, it would be over by now, right? We have a lot of excellent organizations doing really good work on a lot of different things. And yet the system, well, what we know about systems is that they are designed to resist change. And they are designed, even when you get them to change, to snap back to their old ways of being. So how do we help understand our contribution without having to either overly take credit for causation or declaring defeat because we didn't actually cause a thing?
I think that the piece that sits with me in racial equity work is that each of us does have a role to make change happen. And I think each person on this call, each person on this webinar has something in their sphere of influence that they can do. And I think for those of us who are funders of evaluation work, for those of us who do evaluation work, making sure to create the time for trust building and making sure to create the time and resources to really have the conversations that say, will this help to advance racial equity, or will it cause additional harm? And if it will cause additional harm, we have to shift what's happening, and we each have a role in that.
Thank you. I mean, this is what I heard from you all, and I will take this with me. It's that we have to step up and lean in, that this is really our moment, right? We're seeing a lot of change and we need to pivot and we need to give up some of those old ways of thinking, that this is complex, that we got to stop thinking about causing something to happen, but really how do we help push against resistance? How do we help contribute to the progress? And it's the we. Right? It's the we all have a role and we got to do it together. And our eyes should be on that prize at the end, which is how does it help get us to equity? So Thank you, you all. We're on the dot at 2 p.m. I cannot tell you how amazing you are. What a great conversation it was. To all our listeners, please join us for our next webinar, Culture Matters, Creating Culturally Responsive Evidence-Based Programs. Here's another one, right? How do we define evidence? And it's not just one way, but how do we take into consideration culture and context and what evidence means? So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, Daniel and Evelyn, for helping us with the questions and the chat box.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's respond to that.